Hello, and welcome everyone to the Emancipated Citizen YouTube channel. I am your host, zacaalrayyis. I have been doing some research and writing for quite a bit about the current state of Western politics. If you've been following our pages and looking at current news, the international condemnation of the truly lawless state that we're seeing in the United States and the heavy-handed influence that those agents are taking in Germany and in Europe and elsewhere across the world in dismantling an order that we've really taken for granted, at least since the Second World War across the Western world. I mean, we're in a situation right now where really nobody would have thought we would be here 5 or 10 years ago, right? The free world is really in rapid decline, and the Enlightenment values that brought the Western world to greatness and prosperity that partly the United States was founded on is being systematically undermined from all fronts. The President of the United States has been talking for years about suspending the Constitution. He broke the centuries-long peace that was brought about by the independent judiciary, by the rule of law, as he started to arbitrarily kidnap people and rendition them to places outside of the United States, people whose rights to residency have been upheld time and time again by the courts, and people who have had no opportunity to present their cases in the courts to challenge what is being done to them there. Even United States citizens are being warned by their attorneys to not leave and re-enter the country under this lawless state of affairs. We have heard from lawyers, from officers of the law, some truly shocking stories about the behavior of United States border agents violating residents' and citizens' rights to privacy and violating protected information such as attorney-client privilege. Of course, that's not only happening in the United States, but governments and employers across the developed world are now issuing warnings about entering the United States, advising people to wipe their devices clean, due to the kinds of draconian violations to the rights of privacy and due process, right? I am sure by now we have all heard about at least some of the more prominent cases, such as that of the long legal battle to return Abrego Garcia to the United States after he has been granted the right to residency, after a court has confirmed his right to remain in the United States and specifically not be deported to El Salvador. Now that this individual has been, per court order, returned to the United States, he is being detained upon his own and his attorney's request because the state cannot be trusted to follow the law and the rulings of the courts. And now seriously, if none of this rings the alarm for you, even officers of the law, lawyers, judges, mayors, lawmakers, members of the US Senate are being targeted, are being arrested, right? Are being physically assaulted by Trump's sycophants.
I'm Senator Alex Padilla. I have questions for the secretary, because the fact of the matter is a half a dozen violent criminals.
And this is not normal. This is not part of the regular change of political office and power in democracies as we see changes from legislative period to another. No, this is a very clear attempt to dismantle the whole system. And there is a certain irony to this, because the United States, as one of the oldest continuous democracies in the world, one that many countries modeled themselves after, has kind of forgotten what has made it great and the envy of the world in the first place, right? It was democracy, it was the constitutional order, it was the system of checks and balances, including the authority of the independent judiciary. In the early history of the United States, people across Europe fled the cruel and unpredictable whims of their tyrannical overlords and risked everything for a dream, right? A dream of a new home where they knew their rights, where they cannot be arbitrarily taken and renditioned and tortured or disappeared at the whims of their overlords, where everyone at the very least had the right to defend themselves, to be heard by the courts and by the public, to be judged by clearly defined laws that they have the opportunity to get to know, including, of course, the right to freedom of religion and political expression, among other rights that are being heavily attacked at the moment, right? And in clear view of the alternatives, it's something that almost miraculously many different religious groupings, including Protestants, Jews, Catholics, the irreligious, and many more, united over and decided, hey, like, this is something that we want to keep. We want to be able to coexist under a secular system of rules where we can all follow. And this model became increasingly adopted in other European countries, such as Europe also became the envy of the world, or the rest of the world there. And look, don't misunderstand me, I am not trying to whitewash any of the darker chapters of history. Ideals like equality have obviously never been perfectly applied, right? Democratic representation never really was extended to everyone. And there has always been injustice in America, in Europe, in the Enlightenment world. And I by no means want to downplay that, but we should also not forget the things that gave that part of the world a sort of jumpstart, a certain claim to moral superiority, I would even say, at least from a certain vantage point. Again, there are probably other moral questions that might have been dealt with better in other parts of the world. But talking about this specific dimension of political philosophy, I think there is absolutely something to the idea that the Enlightenment and the values that were developed uniquely in the Western world have had an immensely positive effect on the world and our understandings of human rights and human dignity and the rights to representation. But yeah, the referred to irony here is that perhaps this successful model being adopted by other parts of the world and by other governments may have triggered the fragile American self-perception. It's utterly malignant narcissism. Its view of itself as the greatest nation in the world in every possible sense, and made it somehow seem less unique in that way, thereby solidifying resistance to any sort of progress and thereby resisting any form of progress or any opportunity to admit any sort of flaw or problem to be fixed. This is, of course, something that happens when a nation becomes so obsessed with its own self-image, of its own self-perception, constantly insisting that they're best at doing everything. They're the best nation in the world at everything and resisting any form of progress, right? I mean, I've seen this. I've seen this in my own home country. I've seen this in Saudi Arabia. Talked about some of my experiences both on this channel and on other platforms. I mean, it's where I spent most of my life, and there I have known many people to have tragically been disappeared, to be detained for extended periods without a day in court, right? Without any opportunity to adequately defend themselves. I've known people to be arbitrarily punished for their religious views, for their sexual orientation, for whom they love, for their private expressions, for their public expressions, for liking the wrong posts online, for their sexuality, right? All at the arbitrary discretions, at the whims of the House of Saud and their marionettes. A system where the rules aren't clear, even when there are rules. Kind of depends on who you are, who your connections are, and so on. And that's, of course, it's a system without any clear and consistently applied guidelines or rules for government conduct, for discovery, for procedure, where I personally couldn't even know if I was safe, especially the more disagreeable views or opinions that I might have and express in a public or a private setting. Of course, 2018 and the time surrounding that was a very politically hectic time in Saudi Arabia. I have known a number of people to have been shockingly arrested or disappeared. And since then, of course, the apparatus of state surveillance has become so terrifying that I personally could never know if I was safe, especially the more I express myself publicly or privately. It increasingly seemed to not make a difference. And yeah, I mean, I've seen it happen to enough people. I've been threatened by enough people, and I was, as a result, also willing to risk everything for this dream. For freedom, for security under the law. My work, the taxes I pay, all of that is contingent on the reliability of the German judiciary, the fact that it has determined my right to residency, the fact that those court proceedings and rulings do mean something, and that means I can move freely, I can take up employment, I will pay my taxes. I will also contribute to the community, which is of course not possible when you look at some Hispanic communities in the United States, especially day workers going to places to get temporary work. Right, many of them are even documented residents, some of them are undocumented. Without the security under the law, you're not going to have productive economic activity either. Which may seem like a sort of a commodification of the human experience, which I personally don't like to do that much, but it is certainly a dimension that contributes to a nation's well-being and towards, people's welfare in general. So hopefully very soon I'll be able to call myself a German citizen as well, but every time I see the polls, to be quite honest, I feel horrified and I feel nauseated, right? In February, we saw the results of the federal election with the Christian Democratic Party coming out on top. Almost as a close second was the AfD, the Alternative für Deutschland, a party that has consistently made use of Nazi election strategies, Nazi flyers, Nazi slogans. Certain members of such party even probably identifying with those labels, right? We're seeing mistakes that we have sworn as a nation to never repeat being repeated. And this time, the Americans are not going to be here to help to restore the free and democratic constitutional order. They are the ones interfering to destroy it. And I'm not being hyperbolic here. Do believe me, I know that those Nazi comparisons have been exhausted and overused by all sides for a very long time, such as that they have lost their shock value. I know that. I understand that we are all tired of it and that ultimately it only serves the real Nazis when they come back for a free and constitutional order. I understand that we are all tired of it and that ultimately this will only serve the real Nazis when they come back for our free and democratic constitutional order. That is because we will inevitably be perceived at that point as the boy who cried wolf. What I am talking about, however, is a party that openly takes and recycles slogans, flyers, campaign strategies, as I said, of the National Socialist German Workers' Party, also known for short as the Nazi Party. The points of continuation that I'm about to bring up here are not simple points of similarity. It's not just about hardcore nationalism or racism or authoritarianism, which can be applied in many dictatorial movements and of course are extremely concerning by themselves. But what I am talking about here is the deliberate revival and imitation of the Nazi tradition. That is in a manner that no reasonable observer would ascribe to coincidental similarity here. Of course, again, the party that I'm talking about is Germany's far-right nationalist party, the AfD, the Alternative für Deutschland. I will demonstrate to you the point of unmistakable inspiration from the original Nazis and then perhaps zoom out to the threat to the constitutional democratic order of the free world and how it will affect all of us if not stopped. And perhaps at the end, ponder how freedom may be defended both collectively and also institutionally. So starting with Exhibit A, Nazi flyers. During the run-up of the 2025 federal election, the AfD handed out flyers with the title Deportation Ticket. On it says passenger, illegal immigrant, one-way ticket, and destination, safe country of origin to people who are brown, black, or otherwise look foreign. They distributed them in the mailboxes of individuals and families with names that seem foreign as well. And this was not some local rogue group that was acting independently as some people might claim, but this was de facto endorsed and posted about by high-level party officials, particularly demonstrated through this specific campaign being presented at the main party convention in Riesa last year. So even though the main party leadership may have said that they don't have anything to do with this officially, this circled around and was repeated in multiple different locations from the original location of Karlsruhe there, right? Now, this is not only as disgusting and openly racist as a campaign stunt can possibly get, but it is clearly modeled on this flyer, which the Nazis handed out to Jewish-looking people. It says on it, free ticket to Jerusalem, valid at any German train station, and one-way ticket. Now, to point out the obvious, of course, neither of them are real tickets. There is no train from Germany to Jerusalem, and you also can't tell somebody's residency by the way that they look or their last name on a mailbox. That goes without saying. But just as we are seeing with Trump's targeting of ethnically diverse, documented and legal residents not convicted of any wrongdoing whatsoever, the illegal immigrants bit is nothing more than a flimsy excuse here. What this is about in both cases is the illegal reinstitutionalization of racism as government policy, in the case of the AfD, through the tried and true methods of the Nazi Party. So moving on to Exhibit B. Nazi slogans. Meet this guy here. Björn Höcke, the leader of the most powerful political party in the state of Thuringia. In May of 2021, police in Sachsen-Anhalt started investigating Höcke for using this slogan during a speech. Quote, Alles für Deutschland, end quote. It is a slogan that was once used by the Nazi SS paramilitary, which is banned in Germany today, of course. When he was asked about this on multiple occasions, including in court, he claimed to have no idea where the phrase came from, and yet he instigated himself as a victim of government censorship, and instead of trying to obscure his supposed ignorance of German history, having previously been a history teacher himself, he made it a central point of his rallies. He repeated it over and over again in reference to the incidents, supposedly, and he transformed it into his own slogan to be repeated by his crowd.
Alles für unsere Heimat, alles für Sachsen-Anhalt, alles für...
May and July of 2024, the first incident incurred a conviction and a fine of 13,000 euro, and the second one of just under 17,000. Now, this was not the first nor the last of such incidents where he demonstrated the crossing of the gradient between simple dog whistling and overt incitement. I will circle back to how this connects to the main federal body of the party, to demonstrate just how much this is indeed representative of the party as a whole. But continuing on what I was saying about the crossing of that gradient between simple dog whistling and overt incitement, I think a perfect case study for this would be his book titled Never Twice in the Same River, or in German, Nie zweimal im selben Fluss. There he traverses that gradient forwards and backwards repeatedly and gracefully, and where Many passages are truly indistinguishable from the writings of Adolf Hitler himself. For example, in the context of the beginning chapters of the book, loaded with thinly veiled insinuation that Germany remains today under occupation since its end of the Second World War, that it should free itself from international cooperation structures such as NATO and the EU and arise as a military superpower in its own right. He said the following in dialogue with a retired general as the latter floated the idea of a military coup and whether it would be a practicable possibility. Quote, "Even though the lieutenant colonel certainly misspoke in that statement, it illustrates the growing frustration of many soldiers. It remains to be seen whether this will lead to any positive consequences, because truly heretical positions have so far only, and that in itself is telling, come from retired generals. I therefore fear no." Now, this, of course, reflects Höcker's general theme of institutional conformity and suppressed nationalist dissent. Let me present to you another quote here, for instance. Quote, "Even though, unfortunately, we may lose some parts of our people who are too weak or unwilling to resist the advancing Africanization, Orientalization, and Islamization, but aside from this potential bloodletting, we Germans have demonstrated exceptional regenerative strength throughout history after dramatic declines. When the time for change arrives, we Germans don't do half measures." End quote. Here I would like to shift your focus to the used word bloodletting, in German Adalas, in conjugation with the word people or Volk in German. The talk here is plainly about the elimination of Germans who are not willing to work with the author's racist agenda through the use of metaphorical language very deeply rooted in the National Socialist tradition of purifying the blood of the people, as well as the metaphor for the people as one body that you might need to clear of infections, that being foreigners, right, or parasites is a way that Jews were talked about back then, talking about bloodletting parts of the folk's body, the people's body that has been corrupted and must be gotten rid of. Really, I mean, if you have any knowledge about National Socialist ideology, metaphorical language, and worldviews, this should ring all the alarms for you. And I mean, somebody who talks like that is a Nazi, period. There's no way around it. And of course, also the phrase about no half measures also carries some very heavy historical undertones. Let me present to you one last quote here. Quote, "In addition to protecting our national and European external borders, a large-scale remigration project will be necessary. And in this, I fear, we will not be able to avoid a policy of what Peter Sturdivec called well-tempered cruelty. That means human hardship and unpleasant scenes will not always be avoidable." End quote. Now, I would like to use this opportunity to point something out, even though I feel like this quote can't stand by itself. What I want to point out is how the dogmatic ideology of hardcore nationalism and national borders can go too far in instances where you know that there is war, there is genocide, or some very serious life-threatening conditions threatening people if they are turned back. And this is simply taken as a cost to be accepted after the Second World War, and especially in consideration of the Jews that were turned back from America and other places only to be exterminated during the Holocaust. We saw the horrors that came from that, and we also realized that we are entirely capable of avoiding those horrendous scenes of human hardship at least in some cases where those people are asking for help, right? So of course it is not a question of whether those things are avoidable within this framework. It's a question of whether you want to hold on to an antiquated concept of nationhood at the cost of your humanity. In any case, there is far more to learn about this character and his followers in the AfD, and much more to debate about how mainstream his wing in the party is, but it should be reasonable to any observer that this tendency is gaining and not losing influence within the party. This, on a final note, should be demonstrable of this fact. In response to a controversial speech that Höcke gave in Dresden in 2017, where he referred to the Holocaust Memorial in Berlin as a monument of shame and called for a 180-degree turn in Germany's remembrance culture. The Federal Party leadership, including Weidel, accused Höcke of exhibiting a, quote, excessive closeness to National Socialism, and a, quote, fundamental rejection of the party system. Upon this, they initiated proceedings to expel Höcke from the party, which ultimately failed after internal party deliberation, which was one of the events that showed that the party really has no internal mechanism to exclude the most extreme of far-right anti-democratic forces. Weidel has now come closer to Höcke and reportedly looks back at this as a mistake. When asked about this incident now, she would defend Höcke by saying that, well, he wins the party votes, which, okay, this is true. But do consider the question. Now, if this type of behavior is what mobilizes your party's base, then what does that say about the intellectual tradition that your party is built on, and let alone what it says about your own integrity? That you seem to be following his lead upon the success of those methods? What does that say about you? It might not mean that you are a convicted Nazi yourself, but it certainly does mean that you're willing to make common cause with them, even when you undeniably know what their intentions are, right? Furthermore, Höcke and the party leadership, including Alice Weidel, call the mentioned court ruling about the mentioned slogan a farce and a smear campaign, still insisting that he didn't know about the history of the slogan despite being a history teacher, as I said, doing it repeatedly. Yet in a very, very cheeky move as our last government collapsed, the federal representation of the party decided on a new slogan for the party, which was Alice für Deutschland. This one has nothing to do with the Nazis, by the way. It's Alice, not Alice. Alice, because Alice Weidel. Yeah, it's very subtle. I know, at least subtle enough that we don't have any active prosecutions surrounding this yet. Hey, looking at the way that things are going, you can always use the Nazi slogan now with plausible deniability, because, well, it sounds similar enough to the completely democratic and honest, like, the slogan with no Nazi associations whatsoever. Alice für Deutschland, right? Yeah, this is where we're at. And they came out as the second strongest party at 20% in the last election. Yeah. Hello 2025, I'm sure this is gonna be a wonderful fucking year. I mean, okay, the year is almost... half of the year is gone, but it doesn't look to be getting any better, to be honest. Exhibit C. A Nazi insurrection. In August of 2020, a group of right-wing conspiracy theorists, some carrying flags of the former German Empire, QAnon, among other movements, as well as so-called Reichsbürger. Those are Germans who consider themselves subject to the German Empire and dispute the legitimacy of the modern German nation-state. As that group tried to storm the German parliament building at that time, they overwhelmed the small police force that was present at the time, before fortunately finally being held back by reinforcements. Between 300 and 400 arrests were made that day, including a former AfD member of parliament, Brigitte Winkelmann, who is being held for allegedly sharing plans and insider knowledge about the security situation inside of the Bundestag. As of the end of last year, it seems, according to credible intelligence reports from institutes such as Stern and RTL, that current members of parliament from this party still visit her in prison. Now, granted, this was a very, very weird plot, a mix of Nazis, Reichsbürger, anti-vax conspiracists, as well as QAnon-adjacent Trump loyalists who spread rumors about Trump arriving in Berlin on a megaphone. And although this operation was a complete failure and there is granted no evidence of high-level party planning from the side of the AfD, there's also no denying the close relationship that this party has to extremist conspiracy and Reichsbürger movements that openly strive to dismantle democracy, and that they will betray their country whenever given their opportunity. Another key element of this that I think is worth paying attention to is the Trump connection, which is not only bizarre but also quite significant in relation to the January 6th insurrection that happened in Washington just a few months later, as well as how it foreshadowed the 2024 and 25 heavy-handed interference by the Trump campaign and administration within German politics, under which efforts, especially with figures such as J.D. Vance and Elon Musk, their efforts were focused on rehabilitating and promoting neo-Nazis and other extremists and to rehabilitate them into polite society, which truly has been successful very widely in its efforts. Elon Musk's use of his obscene wealth is largely what made this endeavor possible. He actively boosted and promoted the AfD on X, the global communications platform which he bought for the precise purpose of controlling the flow of information and publicly accepted narrative across the world. Musk has also, for some years preceding that, been cultivating a relationship with the largest media conglomerate in Europe, the Axel Springer SE, and its CEO, Matthias Döpfner, another far-right billionaire with an axe to grind against liberal democracy. Now, okay, this alone, I realize, might not be a lot to make such a serious accusation upon, and granted there's also room for interpretation here as far as Döpfner and his relationship to liberal democracy goes. So do take this as my personal opinion with a grain of salt, based on an admittedly lower standard than that which I would apply to the average citizen, considering Döpfner's position as one of the most powerful leaders in media in this country. But here's what my opinion is further based on. Döpfner also maintains a close relationship with the German-American billionaire Peter Thiel, and Döpfner's son works directly with him in the United States. Now, if you have never heard of Thiel before, he is one of the more openly combative personalities against democracy in the so-called libertarian movement. And he's also one of the longest-running donors of the Trump campaign since 2016 or 2015. Let me present to you a representative quote from his 2009 essay, The Education of a Libertarian. Quote, "I no longer believe that freedom and democracy are compatible." End quote. Now do read this for yourself, and you will see that this is in no way taken out of context. But what does he even mean by freedom here if it doesn't include the people's freedom to determine their fate as a society, right? Fortunately, he does expound on his conception of freedom in the same essay, saying, quote, "Since 1920, the vast increase in welfare beneficiaries and the extension of the franchise to women, two constituencies that are notoriously tough for libertarians, have rendered the notion of capitalist democracy into an oxymoron." End quote. So clearly to Thiel, at least, if not to all so-called libertarians, freedom has nothing to do with democratic self-determination. It's synonymous with capitalism, which he perceives to be under threat from women, from the impoverished, and from other minorities. To those people, the most sacred freedom is the freedom to hoard and invest capital without any state interference. This freedom should trample all civil rights and freedoms to political participation, not to mention the most basic human needs such as food, medicine, and housing. It's of course based upon the notion that one should not be expected to pay back into the society upon which that capital was built, or otherwise show any solidarity with the less fortunate. And look, Thiel might be unique in his honesty about his blatant anti-democratic agenda and flagrant bolstering of authoritarianism. But what a lot of other people believe behind the scenes, what other people discuss behind the scenes, what we have been seeing from Elon Musk lately, in some part we've been seeing from other billionaires, including Matthias Döpfner, there are a lot of facts that do point towards the conclusion that it should be accepted by now that this political leaning is widespread among the billionaire class at this point. I mean, both Musk and Döpfner also call themselves libertarians, and it's evident here, at least in some cases, if not all, that libertarianism is not a distinctive political ideology. It is fascism trying to disguise itself as anarchism. We saw this with Thiel a long time ago. We saw this with Musk more recently at the Trump inauguration with his Nazi salute, some things before that, some things after that. Where do Döpfner and his media empire stand? I think I've expressed my opinion on this, and you can look at the facts and inform yours. Musk and Döpfner have known each other for at least 10 years. And in December of 2020, Musk was awarded by Matthias Döpfner the Axel Springer Award and interviewed on very favorable terms there. Since then, the two have been seen together at public and private functions, and, well, I guess it would have been one of those weird billionaire far-right oligarch friendships. That's a bit weird, but nothing to concern ourselves too much about, until the Elon Musk op-ed of December of 2024, which was quite the scandal in Germany, in German media, and for the Axel Springer Verlag. That is when Elon Musk was invited to write an op-ed in the Springer magazine Welt. There he portrayed the AfD as Germany's last hope. He called upon white supremacist conspiracy theories and presented a typical misrepresentation of historical responsibility, as he is known for when talking about topics especially like the Holocaust. Even before that, and less widely known, is that Döpfner apparently was the one who originally made the suggestion that Musk buy Twitter, offering to manage it through his own media empire. Now, of course, the latter part of this suggestion was never taken up, but, I mean, a worse disaster resulting from it is hardly even imaginable at this point, right? In any case, the Welt op-ed was a decisive turn in the German media landscape, at least from the public perspective. That is because, as a result, upstanding and respectable journalists resigned from their positions en masse in an organization that had an increasingly obvious extremist right-wing agenda. As a result, the organization moved even further to the right. At the end of January of this year, I took part in an event at the Axel Springer headquarters, and I experienced something there all around me that I had not experienced in the last 7 years that I had lived in this country. Shameless, unapologetic, open racism. As Weide, the leader of the AfD, was trying her best to whitewash the party's neo-Nazi ties, we had Elon Musk wired in to basically repeat his white supremacist conspiracy theories and relativizing rhetoric about the Holocaust. That, of course, after the Israeli president gave us a word about how the left was representing anti-Semitism today, and the irony of that. Something I don't think I have any words for at this point, to be quite honest. It's so bizarre. Now, I've never been one to focus on every microaggression or to identify racial motives behind every distasteful interaction, and perhaps it explains the fact that even having lived in Sachsen-Anhalt, I can barely name any examples of such occurrences. Having lived in this country, even within this event, it's also conceivable that certain coincidences may have been misinterpreted as far as treatment and racism and that kind of thing goes. But if the normalization of this type of rhetoric doesn't have an immediate consequence on people of color today, they are bound to eventually, at some point, right? Like the Overton window in this society is shifting so far to the right that things that just 2 years ago you couldn't dream of saying in public are just acceptable. I mean, yeah, like I said, are just acceptable. It was shocking. Of the diverse catering team, multiple people reported undignified treatment. One even broke down emotionally there. Our society is going at an accelerating pace to a place that we've sworn to never go back to. A place that we have long thought that we've evolved past, and the type of antisocial behavior that used to be met with shame and disgust is now just a normal part of polite society. How is this happening to us? This is not even limited to race or immigration, because as we have covered, this is not ultimately about immigration. It is not ultimately about race. It is about power. It's consolidation through the dismantlement of our democratic institutions. Primarily, this is done by exploiting people's growing worries and struggles, fueling divisions and creating scapegoats. I feel like I've watched this movie before, and if I do remember correctly, it does not have a happy end. Now, although my focus has been on a specifically German brand of totalitarianism here, I hope I've made enough connections to make clear that although the extent of harm carried out during the 90s may have been quite unique, the formative elements of which can be observed in all identitarian and totalitarian systems, from China to Saudi Arabia, us versus them thinking, fierce loyalty to the in-group, dehumanization of the out-group, reducing individuals to group identities and placing trust in the hands of one benevolent dictator. A dictator who will use his control over the flow of information to make sure that his authority is never again questioned. Perhaps this is a simple part of human nature. Perhaps it's only a part of its ugliest, darkest part. This ugliness can often repel people from their cultures, their religions of origins, their religion of birth, and lead to a journey of self-discovery. And this is the case for so many self-identifying ex-Muslims. The finer considerations of Muslim and ex-Muslim identities, that's a topic that I've talked about extensively on the podcast, and I will continue to do that. It's a very complex topic where ethnocultural, literary, and political traditions need to be carefully considered, and it is easy when having this discussion to be taken in by the Orientalist trap, where the problematic elements of Islam are seen to either be identical to those of Christianity or antithetical to Christianity and the Western identity as it is understood in conservative circles. That can be the case both on the left and on the right. As such, I do entirely sympathize with those who harshly criticize the left for often shying away from criticism of Islam and Islamic culture, or even broadly labeling it as racist. From my observation, this issue became widely discussed in American and by extension Western culture in the years 2014 and 2015. An emblematic moment of that was one famous or infamous moment on the show Real Time with Bill Maher, where an argument about Islam and between the author Sam Harris and the actor Ben Affleck broke out and went viral.
Yeah, well, liberals have really failed on the topic of theocracy. They'll criticize white theocracy. They'll criticize Christians. They'll still get agitated over the abortion clinic bombing that happened in 1984. But when you want to talk about the treatment of women and homosexuals and free thinkers and public intellectuals in the Muslim world, I would argue that liberals have failed us. And, well, I mean, the crucial point of confusion is that we have been sold this meme of Islamophobia, where every criticism of the doctrine of Islam gets conflated with bigotry toward Muslims as people.
Right.
And that is, it's intellectual.
I'm asking you, so you're saying if I criticize you're saying that Islamophobia is not a real thing. That if you're critical of something...
Well, it's not a real thing when we do it.
Right.
Well, no,
it really isn't.
I'm not denying that certain people are bigoted against Muslims as people.
Right.
And that's a problem.
Big of you.
But
why are you so hostile about this?
It's gross. It's racist.
It's not. It's
In Europe, this was brought also increasingly into public view as the continent became a destination for masses of refugees, people fleeing war mainly from Syria, where the government was massacring and starving the Syrian people, detonating chemical weapons on them and systematically torturing them to death in some of the worst, most cruel prisons in modern human history. That, along with wider instability and repression in the Middle East following the Arab Spring, is sometimes referred to as the Arab Winter, and all in all it has constituted the biggest refugee crisis since the Second World War. Of course, 2015, 2016, that was an extraordinary time by global standards, and the sheer numbers of people who had to flee their homes because of circumstances outside of their control. It was an exceptional situation, and it was kind of a moral test for different nations and different people and different systems. I think it was something that was an opportunity to display the beauty and compassion of the human spirit with some, and with others it was also, of course, an opportunity to display the most vile parts of human nature. And look, I'm not even just talking about Europe when I say that. And look, even being in Saudi Arabia, I have had the experience of watching Yemeni children fleeing police for fear of being returned to a war zone that was being bombed by my very government. The most I could do is shelter them in the car for a few hours or buy them some rice or something. The way that Yemeni refugees were living in constant fear of being returned to starvation and bombing, and there was absolutely no compassion from the side of the state, that I think was a reflection of the ugliness of human nature. And of course, there was other instances where you can see a reflection of the beautiful parts of human nature as well. That is just to say, of course, this one aspect is not limited to Europe, but I mean, speaking about it from a European perspective, to our south, people were drowning; to our east, people were subject to violence and cruelty and a lack of basic human care. In many Eastern European states, we have seen inhuman and absolutely shameful behavior of refugees being attacked, being tortured, mothers carrying their children being tripped and attacked by bystanders who just don't want to see them there. Scenes of horrendous human cruelty. And so Europe had to act together and cooperate on a new level. But still, it was not enough to control the chaos. There was an opportunity for so many people to enrich themselves at the expense of others. Opportunities for human trafficking were seized upon massively, and the situation was also used by many who were not fleeing any danger, but as an easy ticket to Europe. On New Year's Eve of 2015, in the city of Cologne, massive numbers of sexual assaults orchestrated by gangs of men, reportedly of North African features, were reported, and this brought the narrative of contrast between the Islamic world and the Western world into further focus. Now, it is well worth noting here that from what we know about the criminals in question, none were refugees fleeing war. There seemed to be opportunists finding a chaotic situation and taking advantage of it. Now, of course, there is so much more that can be said about the refugee crisis and the challenges that came with it. but for the purposes of the issue at hand, this should suffice as cultural background information, at least for now. The left is often dismissing reasonable, if not always perfectly expressed, criticism of Islam as Islamophobic or racist. The right is jumping on this to amplify Islam-critical voices for an explicitly racist agenda. At the end of 2018, shortly after I started speaking about my views publicly, I was approached by a podcast called The Third Rail to tell my story there. Naively, I did agree to this proposal, and that was before looking into their content. Fortunately, though, I did look at what they stood for before I was supposed to do the interview, and I promptly canceled the appearance. Among other things, they would disparage members of Congress for having African ancestry based on presented IQ measurements of certain African populations. They would promote conspiracy theories about white replacement, Sharia takeover, and that kind of thing. And look, every public ex-Muslim I know has dealt with this issue as well, and it's not an easy one to navigate. As a liberal, you either talk to the side that is willing to talk to you and let them amplify your voice despite their own identitarian and illiberal agenda, or you go your own way with very little support to be found in wider Western society. So I do recognize, of course, that there are deep problems with Islamic dogma and culture, and those are the results of a complex interplay of ancient texts reflecting an outdated worldview and an orthodoxy regarding the authoritative role of said textual tradition and a political tradition that constantly shapes and dictates the nature of that orthodoxy. The Quran by itself, of course, is just a book, and it's no more good or evil than any other ancient record of human heritage. The Muslim is generally just a person raised under a religious tradition with as much capacity for blind obedience and as much capacity for critical thinking as the white American Christian or anyone else. So going back to the Harris-Affleck incident, I do wholeheartedly agree with Harris's characterization of the problem as theocracy. In other words, the problem is political in nature, where religious doctrines play a very significant role in what the masses believe. Understood a certain way, though, it would seem that Sam Harris was trying to present Islamophobia as a sort of myth with the purpose of shutting down criticism of Islam. That, I would argue, is a woefully narrow-minded assessment of the phenomenon. While it is true that Islamists with illiberal agendas have indeed used this characterization to shut down criticism, it is also true that Islamophobia is used as a descriptor for legitimate anti-Muslim bigotry. This less than precise choice of words was exacerbated by Bill Maher's interjection there. Islamophobia, it's not a real thing when we do it.
You're saying that Islamophobia is not a real thing. That if you're critical of something...
Well, it's not a real thing when we do it.
Right.
Now, it's easy here to say that the Ben Affleck side of things was over-interpreting incidental word choices and doing the whole SJW virtue signaling and public shaming thing, which I hear was quite popular at the time, if only it wasn't for the fact that Sam Harris's choice of phrasing was also presented in this overtly racist way by many people in the ethno-nationalist and white supremacist camp as well. Not long after that, of course, Trump came on the scene with his senseless and overtly racist proposal of a Muslim ban, which would not have even blocked the most powerful Islamic agenda pushers from their influence in the US.
Donald J. Trump is calling for a total and complete shutdown of Muslims entering the United States until our country's representatives can figure out what the hell is going on. As
shown by Trump's romance with Saudi and Qatari dictators, I mean, there's really no lack of legitimate criticism directed at liberals for failing to recognize this problem, but it's not like mainstream or far-right conservatives on the other side are properly identifying the problem or its roots either, or proposing sensible solutions. Conservatives in power, in my experience, never want to pay the price of standing up to authoritarianism and human rights abuses. From the 1980s onwards, Saudi Arabia has been expanding its religious influence around the world with military aid, state-run mosques and schools with the help of the United States and its allies. I've made a video about Saudi state education, by the way, some years ago. Some of you may like to watch for better context. Indeed, Osama bin Laden himself came directly from the Saudi Arabian aristocracy before he went rogue and started setting his own agenda. The Islamist movement that orchestrated the 9/11 attacks and brought rise to ISIS, Al-Qaeda. Not just Saudi Arabia, of course, but the region as a whole was and still is enthralled by a political superstructure of Islamist totalitarianism, which many Middle Eastern dictators to this day rely on. I've had class discussions in school where it was fantasized about the pan-Islamist dream of returning to a caliphate, of killing apostates and domestic violence, among other topics. The problem here is not being addressed at all. For the right, it is co-opted to broadly incite against migrants. For the left, it is often easier to just ignore. Indeed, what is more than can be said about any on the right is that the Biden campaign promised to make Saudi Arabia a pariah state in the aftermath of the assassination of the Washington Post journalist Jamal Khashoggi and the wave of mass arrests of civil rights activists in Saudi Arabia, which is also part of the background of my flight from that country. So while the Biden presidency, of course, undoubtedly fell short of many of those campaign promises, as is very often the case with campaign promises, right? Incremental changes were indeed effectuated to exercise pressure on Saudi Arabia and lead to the release of two, at least, of the most prominent secular human rights activists from Saudi prisons. When we look at Muslims in the West, we'll see that they generally fall into one of 5 categories, right? Seeking refuge from war or persecution, here for better economic opportunity, to reunify with their families or their diplomats on the payroll of a foreign government. Now notice that Islamizing the West is not one of those categories. Of course, this is just a stupid conspiracy theory. The first and last categories mentioned, citizens and diplomats, those are people you can't really incite against without serious consequences, right? And those already with settled families here will have some sort of support structure, which really only leaves the least influential and most vulnerable groups of Muslims out there as convenient scapegoats, economic migrants and refugees. Those masses incited against are largely driven by the need to survive. Refugees, especially in my somewhat scientifically and also anecdotally informed opinion, are often driven by abject despair. They're often ideologically disillusioned following their experiences. Many younger refugees also are quite desperate for human connection and a sense of belonging, making them easy to manipulate for predatory groups. And this does, of course, include Islamic extremists. This also includes other groups, such as Jehovah's Witnesses, who are known for targeting refugee camps in their recruitment practices, and sometimes sexual predators as well. Now, do forgive me for the crass listing here, as I by no means do mean to equate those groups, but I want to point out the fact of suggestibility, which actually can also be beneficial. For example, when you're trying to when you're trying to integrate and include such people within a wider society. So the fact is that for those scapegoated, even when they do hold beliefs that are shocking and backwards as a result of indoctrination, they tendentially lack those grand political ambitions and the means to pose a significant danger. More importantly, though, Islamism is a pernicious global political agenda. Refugees are not the ones setting that agenda. The people who are setting that agenda, those are the Gulf and Iranian autocrats. But, I mean, who wants to assign responsibility to someone who can fight back, right? Now, of course, after the supreme leader, a very stable genius, bigly known for inventing words.
I know words. I have the best words.
A lot of words. Words like equalize and kofefe and other words, as well as cozying up to Islamist dictators, found out about the Atlantic Ocean, separating the Islamic world from America. The enemy at that point became brown non-Muslims, who are now the ones bringing crime and rape into the country. People from South America were just as demonized now. So on all sides of the political spectrum, it is absolutely crucial that honest and upstanding people separate criticism of Islam, Islamic authoritarianism and violence, which does absolutely need to be condemned, from bigotry against Muslims and people of Muslim heritage. Instead of passing long overdue judgment here on the Affleck Harris incident, I think perhaps what we should learn from it is that we really need to be careful to be as precise as possible with our language, especially if you're as eloquent and intelligent as a person like Sam Harris. But it's also important to show some human empathy and understanding and charitability in not choosing the most uncharitable and horrible interpretation of what is being said, even when what is being said in front of us is not being expressed in the ideal language here, right? Because I, for one, do not want to live in a society where only two positions on this question are acceptable. That all Muslims are monsters, or that there are absolutely no social problems that come from Islam and it's not a problem worth talking about. Both of those positions, if accepted, are a threat to the constitutional and democratic order. So after my exchange with the Third Rail, we got into this argument where they pointed to the apostate prophet as one of the ex-Muslims who knows what's going on. I messaged him about it, and he said something to the effect that he can't and won't waste his time contradicting every racist bigot co-opting the ex-Muslim movement, which, look, I can empathize with that, especially if you have such a long following, and it's a position one can represent. Until I saw a video of his, more recently, titled, "Will This Party Save Germany and Europe?" interviewing the AfD leader Beatrice von Storch, following in the footsteps of several other ex-Muslim personalities who have regrettably, and perhaps as a result of the dysfunctional political polarization described, built their bases within extremist far-right and anti-democratic circles. This once renowned critic of Islam has taken up a Christian nationalist political and religious identity. A shift that is quite reminiscent with Ayaan Hirsi Ali's essay, "Why I Converted to Christianity." Now, to elaborate on the term and distinguish it from Christianity as a whole, Christian nationalism has more to do with a racialized conception of Christianity, rampant xenophobia and isolationism than it has to do with any theological orthodoxy within Christianity. It's a sort of marker of in-group identity. It's a sort of ethnic marker whereby the Christians, that's us, we're the white people, we have our culture over here, and it doesn't matter really what you believe about the nature of Jesus and God, and whether you're Protestant or Catholic or go to church or don't go to church. It's really more about white nationalism being dressed in the language of Christianity. So I am not particularly interested in criticizing anyone's conversion to Christianity or Islam per se. I rather find it important to focus on religious political movements that affect all of us in a free society. I'm also perfectly aware that there are also other Christian communities, Christian believers who absolutely abhor this kind of appropriation of their religion, and as is the case with all religions, there is diversity within Christianity, of course, and I would not be the first to point out the discrepancies between the rampant xenophobia that those people represent and certain things that Jesus has said about being kind to strangers and refugees and foreigners and that kind of thing. But in any case, I did compose a response video to the one mentioned, but I left it out for the sake of brevity because I do believe that much of what I had to express is in this piece anyway. So I will just suffice by saying the following to my dear fellow ex-Muslims. I understand your anger. I understand your desperate rage at a totalitarian ideology that caused you so much pain and so much loss. I understand the appeal of the Western promise of freedom and human rights. I understand your frustration at a liberal establishment that suppressed your voice over fears that it might be interpreted as racist tokenism, when that might well have been the furthest thing from your mind. You may wonder who other than the racist right is willing to give us a platform, and I honestly don't know. But to support a movement openly fighting against the free and liberal order that we have sought refuge under, that defeats the initial purpose of turning our backs on Islam in almost every ex-Muslim story of coming out and standing up, I see admirable bravery and resilience against the odds, and it would be such a shame if you would give in to the mindless mob now. This is not an attack on conservatives, it's not an attack on Christians or capitalists, as many disagreements that I may have with those groups. This is an appeal to the most basic democratic principles we have taken for granted for the last 2 centuries since the Enlightenment, and upon which parties both on the right and on the left have been built. The CDU in Germany is conservatives and has stood against many initiatives that I as a liberal strongly stand by. I have many political criticisms of a lot of what they do. The US Republican Party for a long time has opposed welfare, LGBTQ rights. We can discuss our disagreements within the framework of a free democratic marketplace of ideas, but what we are seeing today is something entirely different. What we're seeing today is that far-right ideologues are making the very bedrock of political discourse the very subject of debate. Such actors have no right to political participation, not under the US Constitution. The 14th Amendment, Section 3, barring insurrectionists from taking political office, not under the German Basic Law. Article 21(2), stating that those who use the free and democratic order to fight against said order would under circumstances reverse those rights for themselves. Such actors have no right to representation or participation in any sustainable democratic system. It is upon us, though, to ensure that such legal exclusions are consequentially applied as we look forward. Thank you so much for listening. This has been a plea for the free and democratic constitutional order. Do please check us out on Facebook, on Instagram. We'll try to post more regularly on Threads as well. Check us out on Patreon. Check us out on PayPal. You can become a patron for as little as €5 a month. Support this project, support refugees in need. Half of the revenue will go directly to helping refugees get to safety. The other half will of course be used to fund this podcast, because as is the case with a lot of podcasts, this is actually a project that is costing increasingly more money for us and is barely bringing in any revenue to cover any part of the cost. So we would immensely appreciate it if you would help us with our endeavors in helping people around the world, in providing more frequent and higher quality content. Becoming a patron will also give you early access to our content, so there's an extra bonus for you as well. Of course, you can alternatively make a one-time donation over PayPal, which will also be immensely appreciated. Otherwise, check us out on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, YouTube, everywhere else. We look forward to hearing from you. Have a wonderful day, everybody. Have a good night. Stay safe. And goodbye.